It is the most scandalous, heavily guarded secret in the archives of British high society. A cathedral filled with relentless aristocrats, a missing groom, and a bride facing absolute ruin. But what happens when the ruthless duke who steps in to save her is the man she secretly loves? The year was 1888, the height of the London season, and the atmosphere in Mayfair was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and ruthless ambition. At the center of the season's most anticipated matrimonial alliance was Lady Amelia Ashford. Amelia was the eldest daughter of the Earl of Harrington, a man whose illustrious lineage was severely eclipsed by his staggering gambling debts. The Harrington estate, a sprawling but crumbling property in Hampshire, was bleeding money. Amelia, with her striking auburn hair, intelligent hazel eyes, and quiet grace, was her father's sole remaining asset. She was to be married to Lord Theodore Cavendish. Theodore was the younger brother of the Duke of Rothermere. He was everything society adored in a second son, devastatingly handsome, armed with a silver tongue, and entirely unburdened by the crushing responsibilities of a dukedom. He was a fixture at the Prince of Wales's card tables, a known patron of the arts, and an even better-known patron of Parisian actresses. For Theodore, marrying Amelia was a mild inconvenience imposed by his family to settle him down. For Amelia, marrying Theodore was a life sentence. But the true tragedy of Amelia's impending nuptials was not that she was marrying a reckless scoundrel. It was that she was marrying the wrong brother. Alexander Cavendish, the 9th Duke of Rothermere, was the antithesis of Theodore. 10 years his brother's senior, Alexander was a man carved from marble and duty. He had inherited the dukedom at the age of 19 after a tragic carriage accident claimed their father. Since that day, Alexander had spent every waking moment restoring the Cavendish fortune, managing vast estates across England and Scotland, and policing his younger brother's endless scandals. He was fiercely intimidating, possessing a cold, piercing stare that could silence a crowded ballroom. Yet, beneath that impenetrable glacial exterior, a quiet fire burned, one that had been ignited the moment he first saw Amelia Ashford. It happened 7 months before the wedding, during a suffocatingly crowded gala at the Duke of Devonshire's residence. Amelia had retreated to the library to escape the suffocating heat and the relentless, predatory gaze of prospective suitors. She had been standing by a towering mahogany bookshelf, reading the spine of a first edition of Tennyson, when Alexander entered. He hadn't expected anyone to be there. For a fleeting second, the terrifying, unapproachable Duke of Rothermere dropped his guard. They spoke for only 20 minutes, but in the rigid, hyper-polished world of Victorian high society, 20 minutes of unguarded conversation was practically an affair. They spoke of the burden of family legacy, of the poetry they secretly read, and of the quiet, desperate desire to escape the roles society had forced upon them. Amelia saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the profound loneliness of a man who carried the world on his shoulders. And Alexander saw a woman of immense strength, razor-sharp wit, and a gentle soul that made his chest ache. But duty was a cruel master. Alexander was already negotiating the marriage contract between Amelia and his brother Theodore. It was a strategic alliance designed to tie the Harrington political influence to the Cavendish wealth, while hopefully taming Theodore's wild habits. Alexander could not break a contract he had personally orchestrated, nor could he betray his own brother, no matter how unworthy Theodore was. As the wedding day approached, the unspoken tension between Amelia and Alexander became almost unbearable. At family dinners, their eyes would lock from across the long dining table, a devastating exchange of longing and despair that went unnoticed by the oblivious Theodore, who was usually busy drinking the finest Bordeaux and flirting with the parlor maids. Amelia tried to resign herself to her fate. She spent her nights staring out her bedroom window at the London fog, praying for the strength to endure a loveless marriage to a boy who viewed her as nothing more than a fashionable accessory. She would be a Cavendish, yes. She would live at Rothmere House. She would see Alexander every day. And that, she realized with a sickening twist of her stomach, would be her own personal hell. May 14th dawned with brilliant, mocking sunshine. The venue was St. George's, Hanover Square, the undisputed epicenter of aristocratic weddings. The church was adorned with thousands of white lilies imported from the continent, filling the cavernous, vaulted space with a perfume so heavy it bordered on suffocating. By 11 o'clock, the pews were packed with the most powerful figures in the British Empire. The Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, was seated in the second row. The Duchess of Bedford was whispering furiously behind a lace fan to Lady Astor. The collective net worth of the congregation could have funded a small war. In the vestibule, Amelia stood like a beautiful porcelain doll about to be shattered. Her dress was a masterpiece crafted by the House of Worth in Paris yards of ivory duchess, satin, point lace and pearls that weighed heavily on her delicate frame. Her hands, hidden beneath a cascade of white silk, were trembling so violently she had to clench them into fists. Her father, the Earl of Harrington, paced the stone floor, checking his gold pocket watch for the 4th time in 5 minutes. "Where is he?" the Earl hissed, his face flushing a dangerous shade of crimson. "It is 1/4 the hour. This is highly irregular." Highly. Amelia stared blankly at the heavy oak doors leading into the nave. A tiny, treacherous part of her heart was whispering a desperate prayer. Let him not come. Let him disappear. At 20 minutes past the hour, the heavy side door of the vestibule swung open. But it was not Theodore who entered. It was Alexander. The Duke of Rothmere was dressed in impeccable morning attire, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, but his face was ashen. The usual icy composure that defined him was fractured. In his gloved hand, he crushed a piece of parchment. The Earl stopped pacing. The bridesmaids ceased their chatter. The air in the room seemed to vanish. "Rothmere," the Earl barked, stepping forward. "Where is your brother? The Archbishop is waiting." "The Prime Minister is waiting." Alexander did not look at the Earl. His dark, intense gaze locked immediately onto Amelia. The profound sorrow in his eyes made Amelia's breath hitch. "Theodore is not coming," Alexander said. His voice was dangerously quiet, yet it echoed off the stone walls like a gunshot. The Earl stumbled back as if physically struck. "What do you mean he is not coming? Is he ill? Has there been an accident?" Alexander handed the crushed parchment to the Earl. "He left for Dover at dawn. He has taken a ferry to Calais. He eloped in the night with Madame Genevieve, the French opera singer." A collective gasp erupted from the bridesmaids. The Earl's face drained of all color, replacing his previous anger with the sheer, unadulterated terror of total social ruin. In 1888, a bride abandoned at the altar was not just a heartbreak. It was a permanent, irreversible stain. Amelia would be tainted. She would be known forever as the discarded woman. The Harrington family's creditors, waiting eagerly for the Cavendish money to settle the debts, would descend like vultures by nightfall. Her father would be thrown into debtor's prison, and her younger sisters would be rendered entirely unmarriageable. "Ruin," the Earl whispered, dropping the letter. "Utter ruin. You have destroyed us, Rothmere. Your family has destroyed my daughter." Amelia felt the edges of her vision darken. The heavy scent of the lilies suddenly smelled like decay. She closed her eyes, preparing for the inevitable collapse of her entire world. "I will not allow Lady Amelia to be ruined." Alexander's voice sliced through the rising panic. Amelia opened her eyes. Alexander was stepping toward her, completely ignoring the sputtering Earl. He stopped mere inches from her. The proximity of him, The scent of his sandalwood cologne and the sheer, commanding gravity of his presence anchored her to the floor. "The Cavendish family has made a contract with the Harrington family," Alexander stated, his voice ringing with absolute, immovable authority. He turned his head slightly toward the Earl. "A contract I signed as the head of my house. And a Cavendish honors his contracts." The Earl stared at him, bewildered. "What are you saying?" Alexander looked back down at Amelia. The mask of the stoic Duke slipped entirely, revealing the desperate, fiercely protective man underneath. "The banns have been read for a Cavendish and a Ashford," Alexander said softly, speaking only to her now. "The name on the marriage license requires only a signature. The crowd outside is waiting for a Duke's family to provide a groom." Amelia's heart slammed against her ribs. She stared into his dark eyes, searching for pity, but she found none. What she found there made her blood rush like a river. She saw burning, undeniable devotion. "Are you?" Amelia's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you proposing to take his place?" "I am proposing to give you my name, my protection, and my life, Amelia," Alexander murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. "I cannot undo my brother's cowardice, but I swear to you, if you take my hand, no one in that church, no one in this country will ever dare to speak a word against you. You will be the Duchess of Rothermere." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But only if you want this. I will not force you into another prison." The enormity of the moment hung suspended in the air. If she walked out of the church, she was ruined. If she took his hand, she would be married to the most powerful man in England, the man she had spent the last 7 months desperately, hopelessly trying to forget. The organist, unaware of the catastrophe in the vestibule, began to play the opening chords of the bridal chorus. The heavy oak doors to the nave slowly creaked open, revealing the sea of expectant, turning faces. "Amelia," her father pleaded, a broken, desperate sound. Alexander held out his hand. His white glove was steady, but Amelia could see the microscopic tremor in his fingers. He was terrified. The great fearless Duke of Rothermere was terrified she would say no. Amelia looked at the open doors, at the suffocating society that was waiting to devour her. Then she looked back at Alexander. She didn't see a rescue. She saw the man she loved. Slowly, deliberately, Amelia raised her arm. The rustle of her heavy silk gown was the only sound in the room. She placed her trembling, lace-covered hand firmly into the palm of the Duke of Rothermere. "I am ready, Your Grace," she said, her voice finally steady. Alexander's fingers closed around hers in a grip so tight it promised he would never let her go. He turned toward the aisle, pulling her gently to his side. As they stepped across the threshold and into the blinding light of the cathedral, a shockwave ripped through the 600 guests. The whispers began instantly, a rising, frantic hiss of shock and scandal. It wasn't the charming, reckless Lord Theodore walking down the aisle. It was the Duke himself, his face set in stone, leading a bride who was suddenly standing taller than she ever had in her life. The walk down the aisle of St. George's was the longest, most agonizing procession in the history of Mayfair. As Alexander and Amelia moved in perfect, measured synchronization, the silence in the cathedral was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic rustle of Amelia's heavy satin train dragging across the ancient stone floor. The congregation was in a state of suspended shock. In the second row, the Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, sat rigidly, his monocle literally dropping from his eye to dangle against his waistcoat. The formidable Duchess of Bedford, usually a fountain of relentless gossip, sat with her mouth slightly agape, her ivory fan completely still. They had come to witness a union of convenience. Instead, they were witnessing a social coup of unprecedented proportions. At the altar stood the Archbishop of Canterbury, Edward White Benson. His usually serene face was a portrait of deep bewilderment. As the couple halted before him, the archbishop looked past Alexander's broad shoulder, searching the length of the cathedral for the actual groom. "Your Grace," the archbishop whispered, leaning forward, his voice trembling beneath the vaulted ceiling. "There seems to be a grave misunderstanding. Lord Theodore is entirely absent from his duties, Your Grace," Alexander interrupted. His voice was not loud, but it carried the chilling, unquestionable authority of a man who commanded thousands. "I am stepping in as the head of the Cavendish family to honor the contract made with the Earl of Harrington. You will proceed with the ceremony immediately." The archbishop blinked, looking toward the pews where Amelia's father stood, looking simultaneously terrified and relieved. Finding no objection from the bride's family, and utterly intimidated by the glacial stare of the Duke of Rothmere, the archbishop cleared his throat and opened his prayer book. "Dearly beloved," the archbishop began, his voice shaking slightly. Amelia barely heard the ancient liturgy. Her entire world had narrowed down to the warmth of Alexander's hand enveloping hers. She was standing at the precipice of a new life, tethered only by the towering presence of the man beside her. When it came time for the vows, the true weight of what they were doing settled over the church. "I, Alexander James, take thee, Amelia Margaret, to be my wedded wife," Alexander stated. There was no hesitation, no rote recitation. He spoke the words as if they were a sacred oath forged in steel, his dark eyes never leaving her face. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part." Amelia looked up into his face. The rigid, terrifying Duke was gone. In his eyes she saw the same quiet, desperate man from the Devonshire library. "I, Amelia Margaret, take thee, Alexander James," she replied, her voice gaining strength with every syllable. She poured every ounce of her hidden, long-suppressed affection into the words. "To love, cherish, and to obey, till death us do part." Then came the matter of the ring. Theodore, in his cowardly flight, had taken the wedding band. The archbishop paused, realizing the oversight, but Alexander did not hesitate. He reached onto his left hand and pulled off his own signet ring, a massive, heavy gold piece bearing the Cavendish crest, worn by the Dukes of Rothmere for 3 centuries. He took Amelia's delicate left hand and slipped the heavy gold band onto her ring finger. It was far too large, but she immediately curled her fingers inward to hold it against her palm, anchoring it there. It felt like armor. "I pronounce that they be man and wife together," the archbishop concluded, hastily making the sign of the cross. They did not kiss. In the strict confines of Victorian propriety, such a display was reserved for privacy. Instead, Alexander offered his arm, and Amelia took it. As they turned to face the congregation, the organ erupted into a triumphant, almost defiant voluntary. They walked back down the aisle not as a scandalized bride and a substitute groom, but as the Duke and Duchess of Rothmere. The carriage ride to Grosvenor Square was shrouded in heavy, suffocating silence. The adrenaline that had carried Amelia through the ceremony was rapidly fading, replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. She was now married to the most powerful peer in the realm, and a man she was desperately in love with. But did he love her? Or was his sacrifice born entirely of his pathological need to protect his family's honor? When the carriage halted outside the imposing limestone facade of Rothmere House, the footmen rushed to open the doors. Alexander escorted her inside, dismissing the bewildered staff with a single sharp gesture. They stood alone in the grand foyer, surrounded by towering marble columns and ancestral portraits that seemed to glare down at the new, unexpected Duchess. Alexander finally turned to her. The fierce protectiveness that had shielded her at the church had vanished, replaced by a rigid, formal distance. "You are safe now, Amelia," he said, his voice dangerously even. "The vows we took today were a shield against society's cruelty. I know you did not wish to marry me. I know my presence is likely a heavy burden to you. I have instructed the staff to prepare the dowager suite in the West Wing for your exclusive use." Amelia stared at him, her heart shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. He thought she hated him. He had thrown himself on the altar of public scrutiny to save her, believing all the while that she viewed him as a captor. "Alexander," she started, the name feeling foreign and intimate on her tongue. He held up a gloved hand, cutting her off. "You need not thank me nor pretend this is a joyous occasion. You have my name, my wealth, and my absolute protection. In return, I ask only that you manage the household and tolerate my presence at social functions. Beyond that, your life is your own. I will not force myself upon you nor demand anything of you." Before she could form a response, before she could scream that she wanted him to demand everything, he bowed sharply. "I will leave you to rest. Good afternoon, Your Grace." And with that, the Duke of Rothmere turned on his heel and walked into his study, the heavy oak doors clicking firmly shut behind him, leaving Amelia standing alone in a sea of white satin and unspoken heartbreak. For 3 excruciating weeks, the Duke and Duchess of Rothmere played a flawless game of charades. To the outside world, they were impenetrable. The London papers had erupted with the scandal, the Times dedicating 3 columns to the unprecedented substitution at St. George's. But Alexander's ruthless power quickly suffocated the gossip. He ruined the investments of 2 lords who dared to mock Amelia at a club, and society quickly learned that to speak ill of the new Duchess was to invite financial and social suicide. But inside Rothmere House they lived as polite strangers. They dined at opposite ends of a 30-foot mahogany table. They discussed estate finances and upcoming charity galas with the clinical detachment of business partners. Every night, Amelia retreated to the West Wing, clutching his heavy gold signet ring which she had moved to a chain around her neck, while Alexander buried himself in his ledgers, working until dawn to avoid the torture of knowing she was sleeping just down the hall. The fragile, agonizing peace shattered on a violently stormy Tuesday evening in June. Amelia was in the library, curled in a leather armchair near the roaring fireplace, reading the very same edition of Tennyson he had discussed months ago. Alexander was at his massive mahogany desk, reviewing agricultural reports from his Scottish estates. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the relentless pounding of rain against the leaded glass windows. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the library flew open, crashing violently against the wood paneling. Standing in the doorway, soaked to the bone, smelling of stale gin, and looking entirely deranged, was Lord Theodore Cavendish. Amelia gasped, dropping her book. Alexander was on his feet in a fraction of a second, placing himself directly between his brother and his wife. "What is the meaning of this?" Alexander demanded, his voice dropping to a terrifying lethal octave. Theodore stumbled into the room, his clothes ruined, his handsome face twisted into an ugly, bitter sneer. The meaning is that I have returned for my rightful bride, brother." Alexander did not move. "You have no bride. You abandoned her to run off with a Parisian courtesan. She robbed me." Theodore screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Genevieve abandoned me in Calais the moment she realized I hadn't brought the Cavendish ruby necklace. I have been living in squalor for 3 weeks, begging for passage back to England, only to read in a discarded newspaper that my own brother, my saintly, perfect brother, stole my wife. I protected her from the ruin you orchestrated." Alexander roared, stepping forward, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were bone white. "You left her at the altar to face the wrath of London alone. You are a coward, Theodore. You are no longer welcome in this house." Theodore let out a sharp, venomous laugh. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at Alexander. "Do not play the righteous hero with me. I know the truth. I saw the way you looked at her at the Devonshire gala. I saw you watching her when you thought no one was looking. You didn't marry her to save our family's honor. You married her because you wanted her for yourself." Alexander froze. The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He did not deny it. He couldn't. Theodore turned his vicious gaze to Amelia, who had stood up, her heart pounding furiously against her ribs. "And you," Theodore spat, his eyes wild, "you settled for the ancient, boring duke because you realized he had the real power. Did you orchestrate this, Amelia? Did you convince him to cut me off so you could have the title?" Alexander moved to strike him, a murderous rage flashing in his eyes, but a sharp, commanding voice stopped him. "Alexander, stop." It was Amelia. She stepped out from behind the massive desk, her chin held high, her hazel eyes blazing with a fire that made even Theodore take a step back. She did not look like a ruined, discarded bride. She looked exactly like a duchess. "Do not insult your brother by projecting your own petty, greedy nature onto him," Amelia said, her voice ringing clear and cold across the library. "And do not dare to question my motives. You are a boy, Theodore. A frightened, selfish boy who runs from his shadow. I would rather have faced the absolute ruin of society than spend a single night bound to a coward like you." Theodore's mouth opened, but no words came out. Amelia took another step forward, her gaze shifting from Theodore to Alexander. Her voice softened, that the intensity in her words was undeniable. "I did not marry Alexander for his title," she continued, her eyes locked entirely on her husband. "I did not marry him for his wealth or his protection. I married him because I chose him. I have loved him since the moment he walked into the Devonshire library 7 months ago. And when he offered me his hand at the altar, it was not a sacrifice to me. It was an absolute salvation. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the howling wind outside. Alexander stared at her, completely paralyzed. The impenetrable armor he had worn his entire life was fracturing, breaking apart under the weight of her confession. Theodore looked between them, realizing for the first time the massive, insurmountable depth of his own foolishness. He had not been betrayed. He had simply been entirely irrelevant to a love story far greater than himself. "Get out," Alexander whispered. He didn't look at his brother. He couldn't take his eyes off Amelia. "My solicitor will provide you a meager allowance to live in Italy. If you ever set foot in England again, I will see you imprisoned for the debts you owe. Now get out." Theodore knew when he was defeated. He turned and fled into the storm, the heavy front doors slamming shut behind him, sealing his exile forever. The library was quiet once more. Alexander slowly closed the distance between them, his chest heaving. He stopped mere inches from her, looking down into her face as if seeing her for the very first time. "Did you mean it?" he asked, his voice raw, stripped of all its commanding authority. He sounded terrified. "Amelia, please do not lie to me." I could not bear it. Amelia reached up, resting her palm against his cheek. She felt the heavy, rigid tension in his jaw. "I have never lied to you, Alexander. I love you. I have always loved you." With a ragged, desperate sound, Alexander pulled her into his arms. He kissed her with all the starved, pent-up passion of the last 7 months. A fierce, claiming kiss that tasted of salt, rain, and absolute devotion. Amelia clung to him, tangling her fingers in his dark hair, kissing him back with an intensity that finally erased the ghosts of the empty altar. He lifted her easily, carrying her away from the roaring fire, past the heavy mahogany desk and up the grand staircase. He did not take her to the West Wing. He took her to the master suite, laying her gently on the sprawling 4-poster bed. That night there were no shields, no formal distance, and no societal obligations. There was only Alexander and Amelia, two souls who had navigated a labyrinth of duty and scandal to finally find each other in the velvet shadows of their shared truth. The Duke of Rothmere had stepped in to save his brother's bride, that in the end it was the bride who saved him, proving to all of London that the greatest scandals are sometimes simply the beginning of the greatest love stories. Did this scandalous Victorian wedding leave you breathless? If you loved this tale of a ruthless duke stepping in to save his brother's bride and claiming the woman he secretly desired, hit that like button. Share this story with your fellow romance lovers, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, dramatic, historical tales brought to life. What would you do in Amelia's shoes? Tell us in the comments.